evening and welcome to the Moving Home with Charlie weekly workshop with Charlie Lambden and guests. Live at 8 p.m. every Wednesday. This show is here to help all home movers of the UK be better prepared for dealing with the gauntlet that is trying to move home.
Helping make sure everyone has a home. Whether you're buying, selling or both, it's a live show. So if you have a question about your move, pop it in the live chat. In the meantime, sit back, have a noisy slurp of your drink and enjoy the show. Sorry, I can't resist it. Evening, everybody. Hope you're well. Welcome to another Wednesday weekly workshop with me, Charlie Lambden. This is Moving Home with Charlie. And tonight we have a live Q&A with our Moving Home with Charlie's newest conveyancing partner, Damien Todd, who is director of Sweeney Miller Law from Sunderland. It's his first time, so be gentle, because you guys can sometimes get a bit rowdy in the comments. Please be professional, nothing personal, just we can debate whatever you want to debate. But what we're really looking for is your questions, your moving questions, okay, so that are related to conveyancing, related to finding a conveyancer, choosing a conveyancer, how you work with them. Maybe you've got frustrations with your existing conveyancer. Maybe you've got frustrations with the conveyancer on the other side of your transaction and you're not sure what to do about it. Any questions to do with that is fine. Also questions about the whole process, money laundering, everything you have to go through. We're here to answer your questions in the hope that everyone watching this will learn a bit more about the process. Now, as I've said many times on this channel, if you are a seller, I've always recommended that you get your conveyancer instructed before you talk to agents. So that when you go and talk to agents, you're saying to the agents, I've already got my conveyancer lined up and I've already got my property sale ready. It's contract ready. The weeks of work to get the paperwork done are ready, so I can bring my home to the market contract ready, which makes it more attractive to buyers. It improves your chances of getting competing buyers and competing bids, therefore a better price, and will almost always result in the agent agreeing to a slightly lower fee than if you come to them not already contract ready. And the other reason, as a seller, to choose your conveyancer before you go to an agent is because then you avoid the risks of being persuaded, shall we say, to use the agent's recommended conveyancer, which can sometimes be fine. And sometimes good estate agents will only recommend a conveyancer because they know it's a very good conveyancer. But in the big estate agents where they've got these big deals with big panel conveyancers, then you can end up being pushed to use a conveyancer for the wrong reasons and end up with a bad service that can actually end up derailing your transaction completely. So take control of the process, choose your conveyancer before you choose your agent, and choose them very, very carefully. Conveyancing is not a box ticking exercise. There is professional advice required and expected, and professional service needed to get the transaction over the various hurdles you are likely to overcome. But more importantly, to avoid the problem where an inexperienced or low cost, low quality conveyancer might not bother to give you warnings and heads up about problems with the property, where a really good quality conveyancer will. All right. So without further ado, let's bring Damien in and let's get started with the advanced question that we had. So first of all, Damien, evening. Welcome to Moving Home with Charlie. It's very nice to have you here for the first time. How you doing?
Hi, Charlie. Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
So have you had as many storms up there, up in the north in Sunderland, as we've had down south the last week or so? We've had storm after storm.
Yes, we have. And it's usually a little bit colder up north, believe it or not. But I do understand it's been a little bit colder sometimes down there. So,
Yeah.
but yeah, the short answer is yes.
Yeah, fantastic. And I just like to remind everybody that up until we started working together this year, so just in January, you've started taking on the first clients who come from my audience. I've only been working with Thomas Legal, the Gloucester-based conveyancer, who've been fantastic with him for a few years now. And I asked Thomas Legal to recommend me the firm that they thought I should add in as firm number 2 here. And it was Thomas Legal, who are an award-winning firm themselves, who recommended Sweeney Miller Law to me. Because you are also an award-winning conveyancing firm, aren't you?
Yeah, we have won awards. Funnily enough, we're actually up for National Conveyancer of the Year in this year's British Conveyancing Awards. So, yeah, we're down to the final 4 and keeping our fingers crossed that we might take home the big one.
Well, fantastic. And that leads me into the next question, which is, without making this sound like a sales pitch, and I don't want to do it because it sounds like I am as well, but I would love the people watching this who are perhaps about to go through the process of choosing a conveyancer, to understand what it is that sets quality conveyancers apart from the rest. Yeah.
Well, there's many answers, but I think my opinion is that a quality conveyancer will have been trained correctly, because unfortunately the conveyancing market is flooded with conveyancers good, conveyancers bad, and conveyancers terrible. And a lot of it, in my opinion, comes down to training and how quickly conveyancers are let loose on files without the sufficient training. So at our firm, we have an internal training program that we've developed, which we make sure everyone sits through before they touch a live file.
Okay. And so did you actually start the firm? You're one of the founding partners of it, is that right?
I wasn't one of the founding partners, no. The founding partners were Paul Miller and Peter Sweeney, and I acquired my interest in the firm from Paul, together with my business partner Serby and my other business partner, my business partner Jess, and our other business partner Serby. So there's 3 of us that own Sweeney Miller Law, but none of us were the original founding partners.
I see, but now you are one of the owners of Sweeney Miller.
Correct. Yeah? Yes. So there's 3 of us that are owners of the firm. Yeah.
I always think it's nice to see, and this is why I like having Simon on as well from Thomas League as well on the show, because then all of my audience actually get to see the boss, the owner, the person with whom the buck stops for the services you provide. That's fantastic. Right, well, let's get started with the first question that we had. And by the way, guys, if you have questions for these live Q&As on Wednesdays, and you send them to me on social media, so on X or YouTube comments or on Instagram in advance, I always do advanced questions first. So here we are. This is the first one, and it is from someone who calls themselves NF Tupperware on X. And they say, if you have a portion of your deposit, say 30K, in long-term savings, which were accumulated over 7 years ago, how and what, if anything, is needed to satisfy money laundering checks? The person doesn't have any statements older than 7 years, and the funds have been untouched for at least this time. And before you answer, I just want to give the context for everyone, okay? One of the legal requirements that conveyancers are required by law to do is to check that the source of funds looks legit and isn't dodgy, and all conveyancers are required to silently report it to the authorities if they think there's anything sneaky or dodgy about it. Is that right?
That's absolutely correct. Yeah. And it's a real hot topic at the minute, because in the last year, the SRA, the regulator for solicitors, the Solicitors Regulation Authority, they've been fining firms significant amounts of money when they've done investigations, and this has been the hot topic. Have firms completed the necessary money laundering checks, in particular regarding property transactions? To answer the question, what I would firstly do is break it down. There's 2 aspects to money laundering checks, or 2 major aspects regarding the monies that you receive. The first is proof of funds. So proof of funds is establishing evidence that the person who's giving you the funds, the client, that it's their funds. So in this case, a bank statement shown in the client's name, showing that the client has those funds in their own account, that would satisfy your proof of funds, because it's telling you that that client has that amount of funds in their own account. The tricky area is then the second topic, which is source of funds. And source of funds is how did they acquire that wealth? Obviously, because this person has had the funds for a period of 7 years, what we would firstly do is ask, how was the 30k acquired? Was it just savings over time? Was it salary, inheritance, divorce? There's a whole host of ways the money could have been acquired. But what we would also then look at is the surrounding facts. So what is the occupation of the client? If the client said it's from savings, is it likely that client in that particular occupation that they have, could they reasonably have saved that amount over that length of time? If the answer is yes, then what we've got to do is conclude whether we think reasonably that is a satisfactory explanation, and the documents we've been given evidence that. 30k, if the property is a property in London and it's someone who's got a decent job in London, then someone could save 30k relatively easy. Whereas if it was sort of 30k on a property up north, then obviously the average property price up here is 150,000, and again the salary is not as good usually, so you would want to say maybe has it took them a little longer to save that. So the real question to go back to this would be, how was it acquired?
Okay. So in other words, if there was no evidence or story of how it was acquired before the 7 years, then you might have to raise a question, or
you would be interested to know just a general an answer. Most people would be able to tell you generally, and I wouldn't be saying, look, give me the last 7 years or whatever of statements or pay slips. I would just be doing a general check. So we tend to work on 3-month periods. So can you give me, if you're saying it's saved from salary, can you give me three months pay slips so that I can see there's a pattern there that you get paid that particular amount? If it was, savings or shares or inheritance, quite often people do store documents that do evidence a particular lump sum if it's been paid. So, if they had something like that, then that would be even better.
Okay. We've got questions coming in thick and fast now.
Fab.
And I've got another one that is, this is from a YouTube comment, which let's see if I can get up on screen. Actually, I'll just put it on this. Let me just do it like this. I'll get into the live chat, and then it's easier to get on the screen. So this is from someone called Allegra8658 on YouTube, who asks, from a legal perspective, is it permissible to have 2 active house purchase agreements simultaneously, especially when the initial purchase is lagging? I understand there may be moral and financial considerations, but my question focuses solely on the legal aspect.
That's an interesting one. I have to say I've never had that before. What opposing party, I say opposing party, the seller's solicitor in this case, if we believe that they're in a contract race. Now, the typical example of a contract race would be the seller who's looking to sell the property to one buyer and then potentially another buyer, i.e. which buyer is going to be able to complete the transaction first. But if you would define this circumstance as a contract race as well, which I think you potentially could, then I think you would therefore have a legal obligation to inform both sellers that, look, we've got 2 transactions here, and therefore whichever is ready to complete first, assuming that was the defining criteria, we would have to make the seller's solicitor aware on both transactions.
That's fascinating. Yeah, because it's just a contract race, but an unusual way round, right?
Yeah, exactly.
And fair enough, actually, because I know a lot of buyers end up being very frustrated that they've done everything right, and then the seller pulls out for some reason, and so they don't want to wait and start again from zero when the seller changes their mind at the last minute.
Yeah.
Right, lots of questions. So now we've got some questions coming from the comments, and here was a question that came in just before we went on air from Kanibo, who says, if a sale falls through, would the legal fees for a new sale need to be the same as before, or would some of the work already done cover costs associated with the new sale? And I'm assuming that's from a seller's point of view.
Yeah, it depends. This is a tricky one. What I would say is, if the solicitor acting for the seller will obtain certain documents from the land registry, they might obtain ID from a certain source. Anything like that where the seller's paying for those documents, paying for their ID, they shouldn't have to incur that fee twice. However, the seller's solicitor will draft a contract with that particular buyer named, with the buyer's solicitor named. And if that matter became abortive and a new buyer was found, the new buyer's details would have to then be on the new contract. So therefore, it is reasonable that the seller's solicitor might say you will incur a fee. I would never expect it to be the full fee, certainly not. But I do think it's reasonable that a fee might be incurred, a certain percentage. Normally, we at our firm, we would always usually limit it to 25% potentially if the contract, if it was only the contract that you drafted.
Okay, and but it would be different from a buyer's point of view, wouldn't it? If you had a buyer client and their purchase failed for those reasons that they fail, and they had to start again from scratch on a new purchase, that would be a different charge, wouldn't it?
Yeah, well, again, it depends on how far you get in the transaction. You
wouldn't have to charge twice for money laundering and stuff, would you? Because once you've approved source of funds and stuff, that's done, isn't it?
That's correct. Yeah. So what the big cost initially with a purchase transaction is the searches. So once your searches have been ordered, unfortunately, you're going to incur the full fee for those searches, which for a conveyancing transaction on average is anywhere between 180 to 350 £, depending on where you're getting your searches from. In terms of legal fee, again, it would depend on when the transaction became abortive, but the earlier, the more likely it is that the cost would be lowered because there wouldn't be as much work done. With a purchase, for example, if we've had a contract pack in from the seller solicitor, we've reviewed that, we've ordered searches, we've raised inquiries, we might limit our fees to potentially 50%. But what we always do is we'll always say to a client, we'll incentivize any abortive fee so that when they then come back to the market, when they find a new property, the likelihood is that they'll stay with us.
Okay. Right, next question. I think this is a good one as well. A very timely question. So this is Cal on YouTube. He says, if my sale doesn't complete before April the 1st because of slow conveyancing, do I have any grounds to complain or report or get some money back somehow? And what they're talking about is, of course, the stamp duty deadline on the 1st of April, meaning that it could likely alter the price of the transaction, not in the seller's favor, if it's delayed, if completion is delayed by then. Yeah, it's a tricky one, isn't it? I suppose it depends on the reasons.
Yeah, it does, exactly that. It depends entirely on the reasons. To be honest, whether your transaction completes on the 1st of April, obviously the importance there is to do with the stamp duty holiday. But, someone might need to complete during the school holidays because they're a teacher and they're back to work, and people have reasons all the time whereby there's certain circumstances that they need to complete, and it's the same answer really. If you feel like your conveyancers being negligent in terms of not looking at documentation in a timely manner, or not or not even providing the correct advice. Even if they have looked at it, then you've always got room to raise the issue and then investigate that firm's complaints procedure.
All right. But in the real world, how often would a client get any form of compensation from a conveyancer for being slow? I mean, it's a difficult thing to, I mean, even if you were successful, there's going to be some hoops to jump through, aren't there?
Oh, I've got my child shouting at us. Can I pause for 2 seconds?
I can hold the fort for you. Yeah, no problem.
Yes, sorry. Give us 2 minutes.
That's all right, no problem. Yeah, it's fine.
Sorry, 2 seconds.
Oh, what is it? They say never work with children and animals on live telly. Well, I'm with them all. I've got certain kids here too, but I've got some great questions in here, guys, tonight. And while we're waiting for Damien to come back, I just want to also comment on how disappointing Rachel Reeves' speech was today, because I think it completely sidestepped the number one issue holding the economy back, which is unsustainably high housing costs. The costs of housing is the number one reason that the economy hasn't been growing for a long time. As housing costs continue to soak up everybody's money, no one's got spare money to spend with businesses or going out or investing in anything. So I don't think it matters what they try and do. I don't think it matters how many runways they try and build to Heathrow. I don't think it matters how many long words they use and things like Silicon Valley and the Oxcam, Oxford, Cambridge, all of that. It's all just guff, because ultimately economic growth comes from people spending money. And when people don't have any money to spend, they don't spend it, and that keeps growth flat. And we are now paying the bill, I think, socially as a country, for runaway house price growth over the last 20, 30 years, notwithstanding the dips that there have been along that time, which have been caused by things like Help to Buy scheme, things like any kind of market stimulation, basically, has been one of the main culprits of driving house prices so high. And the buy-to-let, of course, buy-to-let mortgages, that kind of stuff. Everything that was an artificial stimulus for house prices is the reason why governments should leave the housing market alone, other than having a ring fence for safety purposes in terms of market regulation. You let the market be, and you let the market be free, and you don't rig it, because when you do, you end up with a country that's maxed itself out on housing costs. And it's not just house prices, it's not just interest rates, it's rents, but it's also now energy costs as well, because of course the cost of living in a house has gone up. We currently have owner-occupier housing inflation at 8%. So in other words, even though house prices themselves have nationally averagely flatlined, but actually coming down quite sharply in some areas, costs of housing is still going up. So it doesn't matter what rabbits Rachel Reeves tries to pull out of the economic hat until they announce massive social house building by the government, as in the government itself paying for and building huge numbers of modern, high quality social homes. Our economy is never going to recover, because we don't have a manufacturing industry to speak of. We are not a leader in AI of any kind, and in any case, China has just completely blown apart the values of AI. Yes, AI can be used to make things slightly more efficient, but without, London has lost its status as the leader of financial services. Yes, it's still a very big part of our economy, but it's lagging and it's slacking, and people are moving away from the London Stock Exchange. So we don't have any of the traditional things that we used to have that kept our economy growing ferociously. And that's why I say you've got to fix housing before you can fix anything else. So this is the message that we all need to be giving to our MPs. Until you fix housing costs and let house prices settle, let rents settle, which is the opposite of what's going to happen with the Renters' Rights Bill. Although Rightmove has reported rents nationally, average national rents have flatlined and are starting to come down. which will be a relief, even if they're not coming down yet. They've stopped going up as sharply. They will still be in some areas going up, but in other areas they're coming down now. That, I think, is a very telling early warning sign of severe recessionary situations coming in. And by the way, guys, as soon as Damien can come back, we've got lots of good questions. Let me what else can we get in here? Any other comments just to chat with you while we wait for Damien? Oh, here he comes. I can hear him coming, I think.
Sorry about that.
No, don't worry. Any of us who have children know exactly what that's like. Do you remember that famous BBC interview where that guy was on global BBC World News having a live interview, and his toddler came bursting into the room and shouting and stuff, and then the nanny came in sliding on the. It was. If you haven't seen it, look it up. It's very, very funny. Anyway, let's get back to the questions. Daria asks, at what point of the purchase process do stamp duty funds have to be transferred to the conveyancers?
Yeah, good question. So stamp duty has to be paid within 14 days of completion. So that being the case, most conveyancers, in fact, all that I'm aware of, they will ask for the stamp duty to be paid before completion occurs. Because if the client has a lender, for example, the lender is also the client of the solicitor, and therefore the solicitor has a duty to the lender to make sure that the lender's charge can get registered, and they can only do that if the stamp duty that is applicable is paid in time.
And I've got an interesting question for you of my own on stamp duty.
Yeah.
Every transaction has to be registered with HMRC, even if it's below the stamp duty threshold. Is that right?
Every transaction, if the consideration is £40,000 or more.
Right. Okay. So every residential property transaction for £40,000 or more must be registered with HMRC, even if there's no stamp duty payable. Is that correct?
That's correct. Yeah.
Is the transaction price also communicated to HMRC?
Yes. So the consideration is communicated as part of the STLT return. Yeah. Yeah.
So I am right when I say that HMRC is in possession of 100% of residential property transaction prices within 30 days of them happening. So within a month, basically. They have that data, don't they?
For any transaction £40,000 or more. So it wouldn't have that small amount of transactions that are less than 40,000.
Yeah. But those are garages.
Yeah, there are some small exceptions whereby a stamp duty land tax form isn't required, but I'd probably say a good 99% of transactions they would have the information.
If HMRC has 99% of residential property transactions data within a month of those completions happening, to be safe, but the land registry takes 3 months to tell us about 8% of them and another year or more before they tell us about 99% of them, it is factually correct to say that HMRC is in possession of current house price completion data, or 99% of it. And there's nothing stopping them from publishing that data. They don't have to publish the names or addresses, the names associated with it, but they could publish the data. It's a choice not to, right? And I find it very strange that the government chooses not to do this. And it's just nice to hear from a conveyancer's mouth, yes, we have to tell HMRC the exact price of every transaction above 40,000 quid within 2 weeks of completion date. Because it confirms what I thought. Because if HMRC chose to just release that without actually, they haven't got to report an average, they haven't got to do any complicated, just release the data set. Just publish the data set. It's public data anyway.
Yeah.
We would know what transactions prices were happening, and all of the mystery and smoke and mirrors around house prices would evaporate. And it is in the government's power to do this and they're not doing it, and it makes me cry. Anyway, never mind. That's a distraction. Good to know. Let me get on to the next one. Yeah, I mean, I think I'd like to add something on that previous question about a conveyancer being slow. If that means you missed the deadline, and I mean, this is why it's so important to choose a conveyancer carefully, isn't it? Because there are sleepy, slow conveyancers out there who will go silent and not return calls. I mean, you have to deal with them, right? You have to deal with them on the other side of transactions.
Yeah.
And what's it like,
I mean,
generally dealing with it?
Yeah. It's one of the biggest frustrations that we have in the conveyancing sector, because you can do your job fantastically. You can tell a client that you will push a transaction through, you'll expedite it as much as possible. However, if you've got one of these, for want of better terminology, sleepy conveyancers on the other side, then unfortunately, certainly if you've got a lender, therefore your client isn't in a position to take a stance on certain things because you've got a lender, and all lenders will require everything sort of, done to the T, if you like. You're dependent on how quick the other side moves, and it's really difficult sometimes to apply pressure to try and get the other side to move as quick as you would like, because generally these sleepy conveyancers, it's very difficult to get them on the telephone. So you send emails, you try and speak to them. Very rare can you speak to them, and that's why it's also good to choose a good estate agent, because usually a good estate agent would be able to pick up the phone to the actual, not necessarily that conveyancer, because they're probably having no luck or the same luck that we are, but they could pick the phone up to their client. And it's important to know that the client is the only real person who can raise a formal complaint. Therefore, if it's the seller's conveyancer that's moving slow, really, we need the seller to be on the phone to them to sort of put a rocket up, because that's where the real pressure can come from, because they're the party that can complain, because we can't complain about the seller's solicitor if we're the buyer's solicitor. Our client, the buyer, can't. The estate agent can't, but their client can.
Just the seller can.
Yeah.
Okay. Right. Onwards. This is a good question from Georgina Clark. We're currently waiting for our exchange date. The mortgage offer expires in March. The seller's estate agent will not discuss dates. There are still some inquiries for them to answer. How can we get a date to plan for? This is a very typical situation, isn't it?
Yeah, this is a common theme in conveyancing, because understandably, sellers and buyers, they want some clarity. They want to be able to have a date to work towards. As most are aware now, the completion date is not legally binding until you're exchanged, and therefore, before exchange, really all you can try to do is have a date that everyone agrees to work towards. Now, some solicitors will agree to work towards a certain date, even if there's certain things that are still outstanding. Some won't. Some will point blank refuse to talk about dates until the file reaches a certain point. So for example, in this case, the seller's solicitor may not be willing to discuss dates because they haven't yet satisfactorily answered all of the buyer's inquiries. I've got files at present where we've got a similar issue. And unfortunately, there's not really a great deal you can do with that. It's just the unfortunate way that the conveyancing sector in England and Wales works. In comparison, if you look at Scotland, they've got a different system whereby there's the financial tie-in when an offer is accepted, which makes people a lot more committed, and therefore there's a lot less uncertainty. But the system we've got that we all work to, unfortunately, exchange is that key. And, you know, up until exchange, anyone can pull out without there being any financial consequences. So it's, yeah, sometimes, unfortunately, if you've got a solicitor involved in the chain that won't discuss dates, unfortunately, there is just going to be that uncertainty.
Yeah. Okay. All right. This is an interesting question. Sir Fleshmorph asks, are the anti-money laundering checks standard for all conveyancers, or does each conveyancer just need to satisfy themselves?
Anti-money laundering checks, we all work from the same set of guidance, the legal sector affinity guidance, but it's a significantly long document. That doesn't necessarily prescribe the sort of detailed way that every conveyancer has to deal with anti-money laundering checks, but it does give you general guidance. So most proof of funds and source of funds checks should be there or thereabouts the same. You know, I mentioned earlier that we would generally look at 3 months bank statements for sort of proof of funds. Others might look at 6 months. But everyone should be looking for proof of funds and source of funds.
And on a similar topic, Mike Dennington says, is it acceptable for a foreign lawyer to send the funds to a UK account after a house sale in another country? Is that proof of good funds? That's an interesting question. In other words, do you trust foreign lawyers?
To be honest, this is a really tricky one, because what we first have to look at is which country is the money's coming from, because there's certain countries that have certain ratings, and there's a blacklist and a grey list on the FATF international regs. And if a country's on the blacklist, then categorically we can't accept money from them.
Are you allowed to tell us
North
which country
Korea,
they are or not?
Russia.
Oh, Russia. Okay, North Korea and Russia.
If a country's on, there's others. If a country's on the grey list, then what we've got to do is do enhanced checks. So go that one step further.
Okay.
If they're not on that list, then what we would want to see is sort of evidence from the solicitors to sort of show clearly that they are a legitimate lawyer, and that transaction has legitimately occurred.
And they weren't dug up from a suitcase in the ground.
Yeah, and that.
Right. Okay. Sorry, guys. I'm trying to get through your questions as quick as we can. Ahmed Ali says, do you have to show proof of funds for the stamp duty money? Interesting.
Yeah. So we, as a solicitor, have to do checks on any money that we take in.
Okay.
So that would include money for stamp duty, because it's hitting our bank account.
Yeah. Okay. That's a yes to that one.
Yeah.
Cal again says, if there is a discrepancy with the title plan, brackets border is not correct, is there a legal responsibility a conveyancer has to abide by to correct that before proceeding with the rest of the sale?
No. When most people talk about boundaries, most people are referring to, as in this question, a title plan, which is the land registry title plan. And title plans have red lines, red edging for the property boundaries. Now, it's important that everyone's aware that those aren't definitive boundary lines. The only way you can get a definitive boundary line is if there's a determined boundary application made at the land registry. So they're only guidelines. So if your title plan is a foot or 2 foot out, then really before you have any definitive evidence, you would have to have a determined boundary application completed by the land registry, which would usually require a site visit so that they could confirm that title plan boundary had that check done. But just as a general principle, a buyer's solicitor will generally send the title plan to the buyer. They'll say to the buyer, look, we won't be visiting the property you have, so can you tell us generally that this title plan looks accurate? So that passes the onus on to the buyer. So you know, if you receive communication from your solicitor stating that this is the plan, can you confirm it's accurate? Make sure you check that, because if you don't, that you're not going to have, or it's likely you're not going to have much repercussions against the solicitor, because the onus is therefore on you, because the solicitor doesn't visit the property.
Right. It's something you really. I mean, I always recommend that buyers always get surveys done, level 2 and level 3 building surveys, and that's the point at which you want to ask. If you've got questions about the boundary, you want to ask a surveyor, don't you?
Yeah.
To check the physical boundaries with the title boundaries. Okay. So Fleshmorph again says, is it faster if the buyer and seller use the same conveyancing company, since there'll be less communication delays? There might be conflict of interest problems. It's not illegal, is it? But it's
you know, the rules that we all work towards, the SRA guidelines state that there are some exceptions as to when the same firm can act for the seller and buyer. However, for a standard transaction where there's no relationship already between the seller and buyer, I find it highly unlikely that the same firm could, unless they had one office who had access to that system, and then another office who didn't have access to the same system. We've got 2 offices, and as a firm, our stance has always been that unfortunately we can't act on both the sale and purchase side, just because you're opening yourself up there to potential litigation from the seller or the buyer if there's a fallout, because what you don't want is the seller or the buyer to state that you as a company have favoured the other person over them.
Yeah. Okay, thank you. And this is actually one of the reasons why I wanted to find a second firm. So with Thomas Legal already were working with me, and now I asked them to pick a firm that they felt was up to their standard, and they chose you. So that if I do have a buyer and a seller both come from my audience, then we've got 2 separate firms, so we haven't got that situation doesn't arise.
2 good firms as well, so we should be able to get it through fairly quickly.
Yeah, exactly. Another question on the funding. Is it possible to get money for the deposit from family in small increments, or is it necessary to bring all the money together? What's the money laundering point of view, and what should be done?
Yeah, so monies that are coming from family are, well, what we've got to do firstly is define, is that a gift, i.e. that family member's giving the money and they're not expecting it back and they're not expecting an interest in the property, or is it a loan? If the buyer's got a mortgage, then usually that lender will not accept or allow that client to accept the money if it's a loan, because that creates an interest in the property. Therefore, usually it's got to be a gift, i.e. not to be repaid. Now, whether that gift is paid, in a lump sum, that's usually the most common occurrence. Whether it's paid in increments over an amount of months or years, again, there's no real criteria on it. We just have to be able to satisfy ourselves. Was that own person's money, or did it originate from family? If it originated from family, it's a gift. If it didn't, it's not a gift.
Okay, understood. An observation here from RG Bargy, who says, my last house sale and the buyer were the same conveyancer, but it didn't speed things up.
Yeah.
They must have both been using a sleepy one.
I suspect so. So. Yeah. Unfortunately.
And actually, on the speed thing here, Darren Elkin says, why are solicitors so slow? They can take 10 days to answer a simple question emailed to them. And I've actually asked Darren, I was like, Darren, I'd love to know how you selected your conveyancing firm. Did you go to an online price comparison engine and pick the cheapest one, possibly? Or did you go to an estate agent and they said, hey, use our guys? Because what happens in that case is that some solicitors will pay referral commissions of up to 70% of the fee you are quoted, meaning that the solicitor themselves only gets 30% of the fee you're paying, and that's not enough to do a proper job. So I would, and also you just get some really crap solicitors who are just very, very slow, and they're in no hurry. They don't care. It's amazing. I have met solicitors like that, and this is why it's important, I think, to pick a firm that right from the outset feels like an efficient firm. When you ring them, when you email them, does it feel like they're a proactive, responsive firm? Okay. I would avoid anyone where there's sleepy communications at the outset, and never, ever, ever choose a conveyancer just on the cheapest one. That is, you're asking for problems. It's a false economy, right? So I've answered that question for you, I think. Do you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, you've hit the nail on the head. Sometimes we will quote a transaction, and we might have a client come back to us and say, I've been quoted cheaper. Can you match that? What I would then usually do is ask where the quotes came from. And, it's like comparing apples and bananas, to be honest, because you wouldn't expect the service or power, for example, if you went and bought a Ferrari, you wouldn't expect that same power if you went and bought, a small car, because you're paying less, therefore you get less.
Exactly.
And quite often, it's a service that's provided, but it's the service, it's given by people, and therefore there's some that are good, there's some that are bad, and sometimes I think people or lay people don't appreciate the fact that it is a service. It's you're not going to get the same service from all solicitors, and unfortunately, generally the cheaper ones usually, not always, but usually give you the poorer service, and that's evidenced by reviews. Have a look at someone's reviews.
Yeah. This is an interesting one. It might not be a conveyancer question, actually, but Ahmed Ali again asks, do you have to show proof of funds if you want to clear the remainder of your mortgage after the fixed term ends, even if it's a large amount? Does the bank care at that point where money comes from? There's no conveyancer involved, is there, at that point?
No, there wouldn't be a conveyancer involved. My basic understanding is that the banks are required to do proof of funds checks, if significant amounts are passed to them, but it's certainly not to the same extent that we're asked to do proof of funds checks. If you speak to any conveyancer regarding proof of funds and source of funds, they will tell you that it's a pet hate, and we think that we're the victim. Why should we have to have the awkward conversations with clients when they've just been able to deposit £50,000 in their bank, over the counter with nothing? It's you know what I mean? But my understanding is there's supposed to be some checks.
This is an interesting question. John HS on YouTube says, is 40 to 60 days a realistic range for a conveyancer to process the legal aspect of a transaction? I've had a few EAs trying to sell me services based on this figure. I already have a conveyancer.
Firstly, it depends on the type of transaction. If you're dealing with a freehold property, generally the average timeframes to complete are a lot less than a leasehold transaction. But 40 to 60 days, really, you need to be talking about ideally a cash buyer and potentially a seller who is contract ready and who is ready to complete as soon as the buyer is ready. That's not a great deal of time. If you've got two good solicitors on either side, then again, that will significantly help.
And if you're not chain, and because Simon David from Thomas Legal said to me one day, he said, Charlie, if a buyer and a seller are both ready, there's nothing to stop an exchange happening in 7 days.
That's entirely correct. If the buyer and seller is ready, and if the title of the property is fairly clear, there's no complexities, the buyer is happy to accept some sort of search insurance policy, therefore not need a full set of searches, exactly right, then technically you could exchange within 7 days. It's just, unfortunately, it's very, very rare you would ever get that. So, when I get these sort of questions answered, I always have to refer back to the typical transaction.
Okay, here's one about, I don't know if you know the answer to this one. Lucina Boss is, I'm sorry if I got that pronunciation wrong. What is the rule about politically exposed person when buying property?
Yeah, so politically exposed people, we have to do a check. So it's part of the anti-money laundering check we do. And that will tell us if the person is a politically exposed person. So, anyone who, for example, is an MP or has a relationship with an MP, if they're family to an MP, and it's all designed to inform the conveyancer whether this person has a significant public duty, and therefore, um, do you have to do that extra level of due diligence? And that's the answer to the question, really. If the person is a politically exposed person, you've got to do over and above. You've got to do enhanced due diligence. So instead of asking for the 3 months bank statements, I might ask for the 6 months. I might ask some questions to the client that I might not ordinarily ask as a normal client. I might arrange a Zoom call with the client, whereas ordinarily I might not have arranged a Zoom call with the client. You want to find out that no one's putting any undue pressure on that person to complete that transaction.
Okay. Now we're starting to run out of time, and I wanted to give you an opportunity. Now I didn't warn you about this one in advance, so apologies if it blindsides you. But if you could say one thing to all movers, whether they're buying or selling, when it comes to conveyancing, what one thing that you would wave a magic wand and they would all know, what would that single piece of advice be to all buyers and sellers when it comes to conveyancing that would help improve the situation?
Good question. I would say make it clear what's your preferred communication method, whether that's telephone, email, and agree a communication standard with the solicitor at the outset. We have some clients who they're investors, the long-term clients. We know that they're happy that we're getting on with the job, and therefore, if they don't hear anything in a week, they're fine. We have some clients who feel like if they're not getting an email every couple of days, something's going wrong. So I think sometimes it's important, certainly from our side, we need to make sure that we're setting clients' expectations well in terms of communication. But I would say on the client side, have that conversation with your solicitor at the outset so that you're aware what they feel is reasonable and you can communicate what you feel is reasonable.
Great. That's great advice. And now, to those of you who have struggled, are looking or thinking about looking to choose a conveyancer, and you haven't managed to find one you're impressed with, the whole reason I have people like Damien and Simon from Thomas Legal, and the same reason I have my mortgage brokers, is that if you can't find someone that you are really satisfied is trustworthy and reliable and going to be a great professional representative for you in your move, that's why I work with these guys. So if you'd like to talk to Damien about using him for your move, the URL underneath him on that side of the screen is where you can put your details in. And there's a question that says, do you prefer to talk south or north? And if you say north, then Damien or his team will be in touch with you. And I wanted to finish with it. And I did mention this before we started, which is the whole concept or the whole subject of uncertainty, life uncertainty. I think this is probably the single biggest underestimated thing by most movers when they embark on whether it's their first purchase or their first sale. They just assume it's all going to go fine until it doesn't. And even when they do go well, you still have a period of uncertainty, and uncertainty stops everyone's life progress in its tracks. And being conveyancers, you are effectively on the front line of that uncertainty, and you're probably hearing from clients on a daily basis who I imagine someone get pretty stressed and upset. I mean, I haven't yet done a video that I need to do about my true feelings on what is coming down the line for the housing market and the moving industry in 2025, because I'm trying to just get perspective and I'll not make it sound too awful, but spoiler alert, I think it's looking really bad in terms, and when I say bad, I mean people's ability to actually complete a move. I'm not talking about prices. I think we're approaching a pricing cliff edge. And when that appears, you then always get this horrible disruption to pipelines for a while. And people's lives get thrown into total uncertainty and chaos, and it's horrible. And I just wondered whether or not you had any observations from your time in this about what movers can do that might help minimize uncertainty, but also point out the things that you have to accept are outside your control.
Yeah.
And you know, how would you set people's expectations? I mean, let's maybe talk about sellers' expectations. It's the first time sale, they're going to sell. They think they're going to be. I mean, I've seen sellers coming through Best Agent looking for agents saying, "We'd like to be moved in 3 months." They've got to sell and buy.
Yeah. Well, the first point to that I would tell a seller is, you know, the typical average time frame for a transaction of this particular type is, you know, this amount of weeks, and generally when you have that conversation, it sometimes they've already had a conversation with the agent, and the agent's told them, yeah, you're going to complete in 2 months, and so they always sometimes they have a bit of a shock when you tell them that, but it is important as soon as possible to give the client realistic expectations. I think the other point during the course of the transaction is making sure the client is absolutely crystal clear as to what are the important milestones in the transaction. You know, exchange is key, but there's also some other big milestones before we get to exchange that can help settle a seller, that can show that a buyer is definitely interested in the transactions progressing nicely. So, for example, on the sales side, if the buyer's solicitor has raised inquiries, that tells you, therefore, that the buyer has given their solicitor their client care documents, they've paid initial monies on account, they've usually ordered searches, therefore tells you that the buyer is committed. So quite often that can settle a seller down. After you've answered the inquiries, next point, when you're starting to talk about dates, is the buyer and the buyer's solicitor open to having that conversation about dates? If you're not getting anywhere regarding dates after you've answered all inquiries, then usually there's a reason. Is there another transaction involved? Is the buyer wanting to delay for some reason? Usually there's a reason. So it's about trying to get to the crux of what that reason is and then relaying that to the seller. So it's all communication. Communication is absolutely paramount, and it's setting realistic expectations from the outset and then updating at timely manners of the key milestones.
Yeah, absolutely. Damien, thank you very much. We had a very entertaining interlude in the middle there where you had to go deal with family.
Sorry about that. That wasn't planned.
Thank you very, very much for your time, for your answers. Thank you for agreeing to work with me at Moving Home with Charlie. Look forward to having you back on a regular basis. But in the meantime, otherwise, just like to say thanks very much. And thank you to everyone for watching tonight. All 500 of you nearly currently watching this live. And I hope you found this useful. Always welcome feedback. And any more questions you have if you're watching this after it's live, pop them in the comments below and we'll see what we can do. But otherwise, everyone have a great night and we'll see you on the next one. Bye, guys.
Cheers.